I noticed something and I wrote this about it. You know that feeling of stepping into a room and realizing that everyone in it had changed because you were there? Like the room was on pause until you walked in and then someone pressed the play button again. I felt it as I took a few steps inside. It was a bank branch I'd never been to before. It was a new branch, the only one in the entire city. It had only been there for a few months. It had a small waiting area, 2 offices with the doors open in front of me, and a counter off to the right. 5 people looked up at once as I walked in, and they all looked surprised. And for a moment, I felt like I shouldn't be there. Before I could decide where to go, 2 people were already walking toward me, both smiling. Then a voice, "How can I help you today?" I said I was there to close a couple of accounts and that I'd called earlier. I hoped someone would remember. The man who greeted me first said he was the one I'd spoken with. Everyone in the room heard us talk, and that seemed to set the scene. He invited us into an empty office on my right. I sat at the end of his desk while he stepped into another room to grab something. My wife sat beside me. My stepson stayed in the waiting area and quickly took a mint from the bowl. You could feel the banker adjusting around the task, not rushing, not stalling, just orienting. He asked how our drive had been as I set my ID on the desk. He knew what needed to be done and began, but soon realized that there was a part of the system he couldn't access from that computer. He excused himself to go ask another banker, then came back and asked us to move to a different office. We sat with another banker. She pulled up my account on her screen. The first banker explained what we needed and then said he'd go prepare the checks at the counter in the other room. I heard a printer starting up and I thought for a moment that the checks were being printed. I thought, wow, that was quick. I was wrong. I could hear conversations with the other bankers in the main room, like they were calling plays in a huddle of a football game. The banker we were sitting with ran into some trouble closing one of the accounts. She called a support number. No one answered and she was on hold. A few minutes later, she figured it out herself and moved through the 3 accounts one by one, closing each. There were pauses, small ones, the kind where someone asks a question without turning their head and the answer comes back almost immediately. The pauses started to make sense. This was the first branch in town. They were all hired locally and never worked for this bank before. They were all still learning the ropes together. We went out to the counter for the checks. The first banker introduced us to others working there, to 2 others. They seemed genuinely happy to meet us. There was a small mismatch in instructions, so I had to explain how I wanted the checks a couple of times. Each time they nodded as if hearing it for the first time. "I'm sorry, just to be sure," they asked again. You could tell they were being careful. I started to realize that no other customers had come into the bank since we had gotten there. It was Friday afternoon. It seemed like there should have been more people. Paychecks needing to be cashed, errands before the weekend, but I never noticed anyone come in. 40 minutes passed without interruption. I noticed because my body kept expecting one. A phone ringing, another customer, some pressure to wrap things up. None of that happened. Instead, the attention stayed on me. As they prepared the checks, different bankers had to enter codes on each other's systems for approval. While we waited, they made small talk, a compliment of my shirt, a question about where we were headed next, just filling time with talk. There were 2 checks that needed to be made. One banker eagerly asked if he could handle one while the other worked on the second. He sighed with a sign of relief and said thank you when the other banker told him he could do that. It didn't feel like they were trying to be overly kind. It felt like they were genuinely very happy to help us. This task for them was much better than talking amongst themselves and waiting for customers, which they may have already been doing for hours until I walked in. We've all been on the other side of waiting, standing behind a counter, sitting at a desk, pretending to check something again just to fill the minutes. What I noticed as I stood waiting was how happy they seemed to be working, doing the steps, focusing on the task, fumbling through it, but working as a team to make sure it was done right. We think of work as something that drains us, and it often does, but sometimes the draining comes from the absence of use, from being ready with nowhere to place that readiness. Here, the readiness had somewhere to go. I watched how they handed tasks to each other without saying so, how one person would pause, sensing another was about to speak, how a form slid across the counter, already aligned, how one baker looked over another's shoulder to read a prompt on the screen. We were all inside the same small purpose together. I caught myself holding my breath, hoping they'd get it right so we wouldn't have to stay longer, while also quietly rooting for them. When it was finished, I slipped the envelopes into my backpack. They wished us well. They didn't immediately turn away to another task. There wasn't one waiting. They said goodbye sincerely. They told us to let them know if we ever needed anything. We stood for a second. Their smiles stayed wide. We smiled back, nodded, said thank you, and turned for the door. As we walked out into the sidewalk, I imagine them probably talking about the interaction with us for a moment before the room went quiet again. It felt like something had folded itself closed and returned where it was stored. And the rest of the day, I kept thinking about the experience, their eagerness to help, the fumbling that came with it being new, and the way I was ready for it to be over, but at the same time forcing myself to not look impatient so I didn't make them feel like they needed to rush, and quietly rooting for their success.